All right. Thank you, everybody, for joining us today on our Monday Zoom and Learn. Again, this Zoom and Learn will happen every Monday, minus holidays. And we hope that you'll join us each week. Each week is another topic to add value to you and your business. So with that said, my name is Tommy Dutcher. Those of you who don't know me, I'm the area sales manager for California Title. And I would love to be able to connect with as many of you as possible to see how I may be able to help benefit you and your business. My goal is to help you increase business. And if there's a way of doing that, I'd like to have an opportunity to speak with you. I can be reached at, all my contact is at Tommy, the number 4 title. So TOMMY 4 title at .com. And you could reach me there. My email, my cell is all located there. So we have a special guest today, Samantha Hayes, and I'm going to allow Mary Jane Morris to introduce her team and our trainer for today.
Hi, everybody. Nice to see you. Always happy to have you here. I have been saying that we've been so focused on the new RPA that I haven't had a chance myself to deep dive into the forms, which is a big confession for me. I live and breathe them like you guys do, but I'm catching up the slack here now. And I'm doing that the best way I know how, which is to bring on Sam Hayes from One Stop TC. You guys are all familiar with her from running the national TC group she runs on Facebook, and from her many times speaking with us. Sam, you look beautiful today. We're so happy to have you with us. And I think I'll just let you do your elevator pitch and take off. Thank you very much for being with us today.
Okay, well, my name is Sam Hayes. I have been a transaction coordinator for almost 19 years. I am a licensed realtor, car forms trainer, wind forms trainer, certified transaction coordinator. I've been part of over 6,700 transactions, and I am a forms nerd. I love this stuff. So if I seem a little excited, it's because I think there's been a lot of problems solved, and I'm really excited to share some of this with you. I know it's a lot to take on, but Mary Jane and I and many of the TCs that I work with, we've been studying this since it started last year. They postponed due to COVID, and then we really all hit the books hard starting in August.
Hey,
So
Sam,
I think
interrupt you. You have a whiteboard next to you that has the sunspot so bright
my light.
right in the middle.
There we go.
Oh, thank you. No, thank you very
No
much.
worries.
I interrupt you.
No worries.
Okay.
Basically, we're here to help you and make your jobs easier. So, Tommy, I'm going to go ahead and share my screen to get this started.
Yep.
Let's see where to go. There it is. Okay. Make this full screen. There we go. Okay, so we're going to talk about car forms today. Now, these are the additional forms that were created. There's a 6.
Where are you going?
I'm sorry. There's 6 new forms being created. There were multiple forms that were slightly changed, and then a few that were removed. So I'm going to go over the new ones first, and then we'll go into just quick detail on the others. I do talk fast, and there can be a lot. So Tommy, if you can watch the chat, and I'll make sure to pause after going through each group to see if there's any questions, I'd appreciate it.
Will do.
Want to start off by saying thank you so very, very much to MJ and Tommy for having me, as always. And a little bit of the same thing I've already shared with you about me and my dog and pony show. The first 4 new forms are actually forms that are typically more in Northern California. I'm not sure how much we're going to see them in Southern California and Riverside, San Diego counties. LA may have more of them. So I definitely, MJ, please jump in, because I'm not as familiar with the co-op and the tenant in common sales, but obviously it's happening enough that these were created. So with the situation is there's now the co-op for the stock cooperative ownership advisory, and then there's also an addendum to the contract. Both of them are explaining why co-ops exist, that they have financial requirements that are similar to HOAs and what has to be disclosed, as well as going through a little bit more of the information about them. And that it's just kind of, you're going to have requirements. You're going to be sharing this. This is not an individual ownership. This isn't like having a single family property. The next one along those lines is the tenancy in common. Same situation where it has limited disclosures. There's financial disclosure and institution requirements. It may be different types of loans. it's something to go through with your clients. I highly recommend, if you are not familiar, like I'm not, with doing these type of transactions, that you definitely have it reviewed with your broker and maybe even your in-house legal counsel. These are going to be a little bit more unique and have some different requirements that we're not used to having. But again, there was enough that addendums were created instead of new contracts, since they're trying to keep everybody on the new RPA, and then advisories to provide to your client for explaining what type of transaction they're about to enter into.
I've never used them at all in my entire 40 years. Didn't even know they existed, frankly, until Carr was revising them recently. So I appreciate your thoroughness, but I would not worry too much about these.
Yeah, that's why I kind of did them really quick, just kind of, I'm going to mention them, but I don't foresee them being something you're going to be doing on a daily basis. Manufactured homes. So the contract for the manufactured purchase agreement has been removed. It's now been redesigned into just an addendum, so you can use the RPA, focusing on the main points that affect manufactured and mobile properties. With this, again, if you're not familiar, I highly suggest you do talk to your broker, or make sure you have somebody who walks you through them, because they're a little bit different. They have some unique lending challenges and still are a great opportunity for your clients. This, though, will not replace, there is the MHA, which is a manufactured housing advisory. You're still going to want to include that with your contract and with your offers.
Hey, Sam, I don't know if everybody else is, but I'm, yeah, okay, there we go.
There we go. I have two screens that are deciding they want to fight today, and typically they don't do that. So apologies. I'm obviously having Mercury retrograde early. Okay, so let's try this again. Here we go. So the key points of this new addendum that you're going to want to look at. With this, you're going to go through if it's clarifying, is it on leased land, or does it actually come with the land underneath and whole real property? You're going to go through, like you did before, the information about the manufacturer of the structure. Is it local tax roll, or is it the annual registration? Because that's the difference between it being, is it on the permanent foundation or not? Is it HCD or the HUD license decal number? You're going to need the serial numbers. You're going to need to have some of these conversations with the other side if you don't have the information before you write the offer. Sometimes sellers do their own financing on the property, so that'll be included. And if it's an assumption of a VA or a CalVet loan, the seller has to receive in writing a release of that liability and substitution, unless there's, for some reason, it's negotiated or there's any delays due to the financial terms that you may have negotiated. It does include, which is a really big point this time that's different, is that it's a mix of personal and real property on some of these sales. And that's not something we're specialists in. We focus on selling real property. So it does do an additional clarification of get legal counsel. The majority of the forms, when they were redone recently, have been kind of just made as easy as possible. They're trying to limit any time that any agent adds any information to a contract, they are practicing law. So by limiting what is able to be added, or re-clarifying that these are not things we're experts in, or to hopefully mitigate some of the litigation that could or has arisen from working with these files.
I'll jump in real quick right there. I mean, on the manufactured pieces, title can be your friend in regards to this. Obviously, we could check for the Schedule 433 or a fixation, a permanent foundation. That would tell us whether or not the structure is going to be a SFR or if it's going to be a mobile home, right? Mobile homes prior to 1976 do not have the ability to be put on a permanent foundation. And typically you're going to see a double escrow happen if it is not, meaning you'll have an escrow for the manufacturer and you'll have an escrow title for the property in which it sits on if they own the property. And MJ does have many that do manufactured homes on her team. So
I also want to point out that this eliminated the mobile home purchase agreement and brought it down to what you really need to know that was on those pages anyway. So not much change as far as the data that you need from when you used to use the mobile home purchase agreement. They are just refocusing, as Sam said, because the RPA is good for every kind of transaction, given the quirks of a probate or of a mobile home or something like that.
And on to the second part of it, it lets you clarify the additional allocation of cost, the fees, any taxes that can be buyer or seller or both split. It goes through and explains the seller has responsibility regarding the documentation and disclosures, reclarifies that they need to share all the information. What's an interesting tweak, which is something those of us that have done mobile homes, it goes into and addresses that residency applications. Some of these parks have age restrictions, or you have to get approved for membership to come in. Sometimes they do some financial things, as well as the park's condition for closings, their requirements to the structure, the buyer, whatever situation. Once that information is shared, similar to getting a late disclosure, the buyer has 5 days from receipt to then either agree to these requirements or cancel the contract. That was something that I don't think was clarified as much previously. And again, this is helping to mitigate litigation, and so that there's no gray area of, well, my broker says, well, it happened on this file. We're getting it in writing so that it's just try and get everybody on the same page, so it's not just out in the ether.
That was the biggest holdup for mobile home sales that are in parks, is the fact that nobody checked with the park until it came down to the last 9th hour.
Yeah. I luckily, after talking to Kathy Edmondson, she's my go-to for lending for mobile home and manufactured property. She did a great class with me one time. She helped me. I didn't even understand, but you really need to make sure your buyer, the second you sign that paperwork, goes and talks to the park and finds out requirements, plus how long it's going to take them to approve. It's similar to an HOA. There can be some time constraints depending on how big of a group it is and how it's run. And is it a couple of people running a mom and pop shop, or is this run by a full property management company? Another clarification is the seller is not assigning or subletting the space to the manufactured home. They are completely, this is going to be done. They're gone. I'm not as familiar. I don't do as many, but obviously that was an issue that was coming up previously. It also states about a caution. The RPA, as we all know, for any property sold in California is sold as is. However, unless that seller is utilizing a licensed realtor or a licensed mobile home dealer, they cannot say that it's as is. They have to go ahead and meet the requirements of the HCD or the National Manufactured Housing Construction Safety Standards of 74. So that's something that, again, I was not aware of, and it definitely is becoming an issue, and it's a clarification, so there's no gray area of who's responsible for what. Okay, let's see. And then does anybody have any questions before I go on to the next form?
I haven't seen any questions in the chat yet, so we'll open it up at the end as well.
Cool. This was a really fun one to read up on. So we all know about the TIP that we've had before. So the tenant was in possession. That only applied if the tenant stayed after close of escrow. Not anymore. If a tenant is in the property during the escrow, even if they're going to vacate prior to the close of escrow, this form needs to be used every single time. There's a lot of different rules and regs with all the changes and everything that just happened with COVID and rental rights. So key points in the beginning, are they going to remain in possession or are they going to vacate? What's interesting is this puts in writing now that if the tenant is supposed to vacate, but they have not 5 days prior to close. So a lot of times, I know I have agents that write offers where, you know, we're closing on the 31st, tenant's going to vacate on the 30th, and we're just going to slam it through. This is now being treated like a final walkthrough where the property is to be vacated 5 days prior to close for everybody to make sure that the property is ready to close. So you're going to want to take that into account when you're setting up your contracts and writing out your time frames. If for some reason the tenant does not vacate the property, will not vacate the property, buyer is allowed to cancel the contract. They are allowed to get their deposit back, and the seller is to reimburse them for reasonable, that's going to be a gray area for everybody, just what's reasonable regarding their investigations and the appraisal. And so that's something that's a new twist on things, but there's a third part to it. If the buyer decides to move forward with the transaction, closes with the tenant in the property, aware that they are going to be responsible for having the tenant vacate or being part of the eviction, then they also, it outlines that they waive all claims to those funds and trying to get them back from the seller. This also clarifies, which has been an issue before, about tenant deposits and unearned rent. The sellers to disclose if any rent's delinquent. And if it is, then they are supposed to credit the buyer in escrow for that. So if there's some issues that are outstanding or rent owed or something along those lines that should be come through, it's something that's agreed to. Sellers to make everything whole. We also need to make sure that the rent cap and just clause addendum is incorporated and disclosed to all parties during the transaction. If the seller for some reason is going to make any changes to any of the leases during the transaction, or a tenant is vacated, that maybe you were buying a 1 to 4 and you're going to live in the front and occupy the back 3, you have to go ahead and you have 5 days to be noticed and then decide if you object, and they can't make those changes. Personal property needs to be outlined. A list. I know this has been an issue for me before with different people didn't want to give you the list, or, oh, it was general, nobody had any documentation. This is now stating that we need to see a list of what's included, who owns the washer dryer, who owns the fridge, what's going to come through. That's just like a disclosure, which will give the same time frame kick over that you do for any delays in your disclosures. It needs to be a clean bill of sale, no warranty, but it also can have no liens, nothing that is owed on the properties. And if any note is in favor of the seller, say the seller's doing a carryback, or any rents, whatever is financially negotiated where the seller would still have part interest, then the buyer is to execute the UCC covering all personal property. Again, these forms are really detailed. This is why we didn't have to have additional contracts anymore. And what's great is it's so much clarification of things that I know were, this party knew about it, but this party didn't. So I actually am kind of excited about these addendums in a weird way, because I think it's going to mitigate a lot of the questions that everybody has.
I have my broker hat is telling me that because they did the waiver of liability, that's between seller and buyer, but it does not include brokers and agents. And so if there's an other line on there, I'd be throwing in the name of my brokerage and my agents as well on the waiver of liability.
I didn't see one, so that may be something that's going to have to be part of one of the revisions that they may not have thought of. But it's when I looked over the form last night, I didn't see anything that popped like that. Clarifying again, the seller's documentation, additional disclosures. This goes straight into, so we don't have to ask for the estoppels anymore. We don't have to keep asking that I want a rental statement. It's all supposed to be provided. What's interesting is it clarifies about the estoppel certificates that seller can't guarantee the tenant's going to cooperate. If you have a tenant who's already, that there's some issues or anything along those lines, or you just can't get a hold of them, sellers can fill out the TEC, the tenant estoppel, to the best of their knowledge, provide it, and then afterwards just state that they weren't able to get it signed by the tenant, but still have it acknowledged by the buyer as received, and acknowledging also that tenant refused to either sign or they couldn't get it signed. Interesting, what also is included now, just again clarifying, I think this was all part of our contracts before, especially it's in the RIPA, but they're just reiterating over and over and over again because we want that clarity. Surveys, plans, engineering documentation. Do you have any permits? Did you make any structural modifications? All of that is to also be incorporated and shared within your disclosure timeframe. So if you know that you're working with an agent who is selling an investment property, I would highly suggest that they go ahead and let the clients know while you're in the listing period, because we know how fast escrows are going right now. Definitely let them know what's going to be required. Have them take a look at this form, and so they can start pulling together documents, touching base with either any accountants or staff that they need some help with.
There was a question in the chat. Said a broker told me that you cannot check the top of box and write in section write in section 3R of the RPA. Seller must deliver property vacant by removing any tenants at least 5 days before close of escrow. Thoughts?
Which one are we on this? Okay. I'm not sure about that. You can do that on, you can negotiate anything and write anything in, but it wasn't something, these were the two options here. And it's pretty clearly spelled out.
I'm reading the question in the chat too, and I'm thinking that they're trying to avoid conflicting instructions, that one says one thing and one says another. So they're probably recommending you use one or the other, or be darn sure that you didn't conflict what you put on the RPA and what you put on the. So
Yeah.
it's the best answer I can give you from the question I have here. If you want to talk about something more specific, you guys always have my number.
Last bit is it just clarifies for seller representation that they have to make sure that there's no pending lawsuits, investigations, or queries being brought before any of the tenants. Like nobody's got any issues against them that already occupy the property, that there are any unsatisfied mechanics liens, property's not subject to bankruptcy. Nobody's owed anything that's not already listed in rental documentation. So you didn't promise the tenant that they could have $20 back because they've been watering the flowers for the past 3 years. all of that, everything has to be in writing and everything is being fully disclosed. Everything that is being furnished is what was used for your books. Nothing's being under the table, nothing's hidden. You've been totally transparent. So those were the really big, exciting new forms. I mean, it wasn't two major ones, but these are all the changes that were made. And this is why I put this in the chat. Let me add it one more time for anybody who's come late. It's just the quick guide from CAR, just it'll kind of summarize these forms. Majority of everything was changed. Let's see, there we go. Majority of everything was changed really just to reflect the RPA and to match numbers and everything along those lines. So is that? Okay. So you've got the guides in there. Sorry for not being pretty, but it was just easier than retyping everything. So I went into this. We're going to start with the AOAA, which is one of my favorite forms in the world because, first of all, now in the new contract, it's a 17-day time frame, as many of us have experienced that last minute. Oh, I'm going to add my wife. Oh, we're going to switch to the LLC. Oh, we're going to switch to the trust, and having to redo all the docs and many people not being familiar with the requirements of adding somebody to the contract. What's interesting about this now is it says that it addresses whether or not they'll be provided, and the new assignee only has to initial the first page of each document. My risk management nerd brain doesn't like that. I have always, even before this form came about, always had anybody added to the contract sign every single page. I like to think a good lawyer could point out that they didn't read it, or how can you guarantee it? If you do the first page, my risk management brain says I would at least say read and received, how many pages, have them sign. Double check with your broker what they want to do, double check with your legal counsel what they want on for yours for additional, but this is the bare minimum of what is required by the contract. It specifies the amount of consideration the buyer has received and if the need for the assignee to be pre-qualified on the deal. The BCO, this is another one that's a big deal. And I know this is something other people, when we're processing files and things, the issue is this now calls out that if mediation and liquidated damages and arbitration are not initialed in the original contract and not called out in the counters, it's no longer part of the contract. I'm a big fan of making sure that you always keep all the pieces together. I know we all get so busy, but DocuSign makes our lives so much easier that I highly suggest it when possible, even in countering stations, if you can keep everything together, because it at least helps those of us on the third party end, myself, lenders, escrow, title. If we have everything that stayed together, we can backtrack. That one missing doc slows all of us down so much. And this little thing may not seem like a big deal at the beginning because we're all happy and we've gone into escrow. It can be a really big thing. So I definitely go ahead.
Sam, I was just going to say, by the way, that was always true about the counteroffer. They just made it more visible now for people. And then I had one question on the AOA. Did we get the piece where if they're only putting it in their trust, we don't need a top to bottom re-sign again?
Yes.
Okay.
That's actually clarified. I believe it's on the RCS, or it's on the AOA. It clarifies, but it's on the RCSD, or there's one other place, I think it's in the contract, that it does clarify that you don't. If you are the, but that's okay. There's a caveat.
Okay.
If it's me, Sam, going to the Brazen Hussy Trust, and I am the only signer for that trust, then you don't need the AOAA. But if suddenly myself and my husband Jed we are both required as signers for the trust, then you do need the AOAA, because Jed is now a new buyer to the transaction because he hasn't seen any of the documentation, which then circles back to why it really is so important that you don't get from escrow the certification of trust or whatever. You need the actual documents, and there is a page in the trust, and it is specifically created for this. Doesn't tell me who gets the money, doesn't tell me who gets the cats. All it tells me is who's supposed to sign and what the authority order is. And that's typically the certification or declaration of trust.
Mhm.
So if you know your client's going to suddenly be signing on behalf of something other than themselves, you want the paperwork to back it up.
Thank you.
So I know, Mary Jane, I agreed, like that's it's gonna be awesome and it'll make lives easier, but I think people are jumping the gun because they're assuming automatically that the trust, if it's trust, then it doesn't matter, but it does. It's how many signers are on behalf of it.
I just, after our initial few classes, it stopped coming up in these notes, these pre-printed notes, and I wondered if they had made it all the way.
The change in the cancellation of contract is it kind of outlines most likely the scenarios for deposit disbursement, starts to explain things. The CCPA is a paragraph. It's become very short. They've gotten just basically to the point with everything. The contingency removal, however, it's interesting. It now breaks it down even more so into like it did before, where you could remove everything but the loan, everything but the HOA. Well, now you can remove all your investigations but the mold or but something along those lines. Same thing for what type of disclosures. Did you receive disclosures but not the statutory? Did you receive everything but maybe you didn't get the fire home hardening? You get to kind of qualify that you're removing everything but and get very specific. It's getting much more detailed, which I think is going to help bring a lot of clarity and also remind people about what is required for doing contingency removal. Any questions?
Nope, nothing in the chat yet.
Boy.
So what's changed on this one, notice to perform is, pretty much just to reflect the contingencies, all the things that were changed in the new RPA. Receipt for reports changed that now you have the buyer has the option to say, no, I don't want links. I want actual documents sent to me. They can then afterwards, you still can send them electronically. You don't have to suddenly produce everything in paper to them, but they have to be PDFs that they are provided, which can be cumbersome. I know some of these documents can be huge and the dropping of the links and everything else along those lines. One thing I would bring up in a couple of the other classes I've been in, the civil code and statute currently does not use the word links. It uses booklets and reports. It's a gray area. It can be a problem. I would definitely talk to your broker of record and legal counsel about what you require. I nerd out and go on the one side, make everybody crazy and send giant things of PDFs because I don't want there to be any gray area and I want proof that I've delivered the booklet. I can't guarantee somebody's clicked on a link and I can at least say I gave you the PDF. But it's definitely something I have a conversation about because if it's coming up like this, there's obviously been issues and people are using that as a problem. The RLAS was just revised to match up again with the rental agreement since that is more of a full actual tenancy situation. The request for repairs was added to update regarding the FHA VA because the FVA for the request for repairs on those type of files has been removed. It also expires after 3 days now. So once the request for repairs gets offered and if it expires and everybody doesn't extend it, the offer is gone. It's much like a counter. It's timed out. So everything either has to start over again. And as we all know, requests for repairs are not a contingency of the contract. So you're probably going to want to start trying to address those a little bit earlier than you were before. It does also agree that once that is accepted, that the contingency for the investigation is removed. That has been an issue that comes up as well. Is the form enough? Do you need to also have the CR removing the investigation contingency? In my happy nerd land, I like both because I like to show that you did it multiple times. Conversation to have with your broker and your legal counsel about what's going to be required for your brokerage. Let's see. The SCO and SMCO, which will be on the next page, they also include information now about addressing for the buyer, the backup offer, seller in possession, residential lease after sale, seller replacement property, and as well as if the seller's doing an exchange. So everything's right there. It's not a gray area. You can just mark a box. Again, and I know we're going to keep beating this dead horse, but it's so great. They're clarifying and trying to make as much make it easier than it ever was before. They don't want agents writing things in. They want you to select the options, and that way there's much more clarity in the transactions. Let's see, and there's our multiple counter offer, as I was saying, same thing there. Now, what's interesting on the SPQ is they've moved everything up to the top. So this question used to be the very last one on page 4. It got missed a lot. It kind of, when everybody's eyes were glazing over from filling out all the forms. This is asking for any reports, any investigations, anything the seller's got documents on. Do they have it? Give it to us. Doesn't matter the year. It actually does some coaching that even if the insurance claim was in 2005, you still should disclose it. It's a little bit more of saying, look, this is just about the history of the property. As I like to say, you know, these are not marketing materials. Your SPQ is not to make the property look pretty. I want the dirt because that's what it's for. It's to give the history and the story of this property and what that seller's experienced while living there. Summary of multiple offers, just changed it a little bit so that now you can go ahead, add the loan type, seller credits, and it just reflects that all contingencies are now 17 days. The next little bits are going to be pretty quick. This is just the forms that have been renamed. So buyer intent to exchange is the BXA. The new construction is the CNCPA. Delivery of increased deposit replaced the RID. LPD is our FLD. I actually want the job up at CAR where you get to name these things, because I don't think they realize we have to say these in normal conversations. But the options and upgrades was changed, and we're now the probate is still the same initials, they just have a dash in between. Wildfire just had the letters move around, so we're now Wildfire Disaster Advisory, not Wildfire Advisory. The minor revisions were very minuscule, but they were changed, so you're going to definitely want to make sure any files you're working on are all the December 2021 forms to make sure your E&O covers you, as well as CAR protections. Okay, any questions before I go to the finale? Okay, so these are the forms that are gone. The buyer demand for release of deposit and the seller demand for release of deposit are both gone. Why? Because this is now clarified in the RPA 14H. It straight out says that escrow and agents, we can't determine if somebody acted in good faith, so we can't be part of you having funds released. That's going to have to go on to legal counsel. These are all, again, limiting the exposure of the agents and clarifying our role and keeping us in our own lane. Summary of the RPA, table of contents, none of that's needed anymore because they weren't really used, as well as we've got the grid. Everything's right there and cleaned up. And the contract paragraph matrix as well. They weren't being used, so they got rid of it. That's why we've got a 16-page contract.
The buyer, I just want to make a note here that the buyer and seller demand for release of deposit was originally intended for clients who disappear. They leave state and they leave you hung and you can't get the signature. Unfortunately, most escrow companies couldn't honor it. And so it wasn't doing anybody any good anyway. But its original intention was just for disappeared parties, that an escrow company could come to a conclusion that that person had disappeared and was not going to be coming back. But that's a hard thing to say, and so most escrow companies would not honor it anyway.
And that's pretty much the summary of all the fun new forms.
While RPA has been mentioned there, again, we did the RPA class, went over the new RPA class last week. That has been recorded. If you guys missed it and you want to go through that, Mary Jane was awesome in being able to try and shorten that down to an hour and a half versus you sit through the board for 5 hours for it. So that is on the YouTube page that's in the chat. You could go there and see all of the recorded Zooms that we've done in the past.
We're starting to have test cases, if you will. People are starting to use some of this new stuff, and I'm starting to get random questions. Things like where to put your pest control. If you want to build your pest control into your allocations of costs, that one's come through quite a bit. There is a spot, and I think it's R and S or O and R, I forget, Sam will tell me, but there is a spot for other terms that's been coming up a lot. Let's see what else.
Pulling one up right now.
Yeah, a couple questions that I got over the last week was seller credits and things like that, where to put them.
Well, the seller credit's going to go into G1, and I'm looking at it right now. That's on the top of page 2 of the RPA. And then if you're going to go into adding for your reports or your additional reports, you can go into Q16 or Q17. And both of those are blank lines that ask for fees or costs and split. Either buyer or seller can split it, or each one can pay. So it's going to be just go line by line through the grid. I think there's a lot of solutions there that we're all not used to seeing because we're just not used to working with this yet. But they've really tried to build in every opportunity. Plus R is other terms, and that's at the bottom of page 3 that you can always use to, if there's anything that wasn't covered.
Sam, I've had that new appraisal box question over and over and over, so much so that I am personally confused myself. The spot where you can now say what you're willing to, the property can appraise
Oh,
to this amount. I would love to hear somebody say it. Can you say it straight yet? I haven't been able to say it straight. Now, is the intention that we put in my understanding was the intention is that we put in the number that we're willing to have an appraisal come in at, correct?
that's my understanding, but this has been an issue where somebody says, okay, I've got an extra 20,000.
Right.
Let's go ahead and say we can do 20,000 loan. I'll just make it the difference, not taking into account that 20,000 might be part of their closing costs, might be part of miscellaneous fees, as we know, that come up. So this is definitely something where you're going to be wanting to run some net sheets before and definitely talk to your clients and really make sure they understand what that means, and also touch base with the lender.
There was definitely some questions that came up over the last week was gap coverage. And there's a little spot in the new RPA there where it says, you know, it's kind of a checkbox and it gives you like 2 small lines to write in, but it doesn't give you much to be able to type in there what, you know, what the negotiated contract is. You know, if somebody says, I'm willing to pay you X with a $20,000 gap coverage on appraised value up to sales price, they don't leave you enough room to really write all that in there.
So I've had to recommend people go back to some common language that they were used to and that they were sure what they were saying, so that they, I do want to tell you that just like the EMB, if you use a percentage, or the loan amount if you use a percentage, if the sales price changes, those are mentally, if not in writing, adjusted to match the new sales price. I think that's causing some confusion in the appraisal too, because people are like, well, what if they bump me sky high and and my gap's not enough? And I just sigh when someone calls me with that question right now. And I think it's, I think you guys know me well enough that when I say that, I'm really struggling with that particular paragraph, how to give good instruction on that paragraph. How do you explain it, Sam?
Well, on 3R, if there's some verbiage that they've been directed through their legal or broker, is you've got 3 full lines on here, which will lead to a TOA if you do need to type things in. But again, I'm going to put with that same caveat, and I understand that it is a challenge, and there's going to be, as you and I knew, there were going to be growing pains with working with all the new forms and everything else. Just make sure you've got it reviewed by your broker, make sure it's reviewed by legal counsel, because anything you add to a contract, you are practicing law.
There was such excitement for that paragraph. Like, people were really excited to hear it, but then when I tried to explain it, it fizzled right in front of me, you know, over and over again. It was it's frustrating. I also want to mention, Sam, you can remind me with the paragraphs right after the grid. I think it's 4A, B, and C, where you say, you know, where they've eliminated the 2 forms and they've turned them both into addendums, now the mobile home and the probate. And then right below that, it says what forms are going to be part of a fully executed contract. And then in C, these forms are not part of a fully executed contract. I think I've had a lot of questions about that one as well, because people are forgetting to build their addendums into 4B. And I've already had one deal where it was not fully executed. It was not in there to be fully executed. And the seller used it as an opportunity to say that they didn't agree to this addendum. And a second case where it was on a text overflow addendum. Text overflow was not put into the intention of I think it's 4B. I'm gonna grab a contract in front of me.
No, it is. You're looking at, yeah, it's 4B
Okay,
with other addenda.
Was that the items that you intend to be fully executed are in 4B, and have them come back with a fully executed contract. Otherwise, the other parties are not obligated to complete, you know, the part in a partial list on C, where you're not going to get the buyer's inspection advisory. I have to tell you, I think that's the one that's going to throw most people, because we're so used to it being the last page of the purchase contract, and now it's completely been downgraded to an advisory. But my point of this comment that I want to make is that 4B was intended for the items that you want to be fully executed in this contract to come back with a fully executed contract. So make sure you're working your addendums and your things in there.
Hey, Sam, can you
Yeah.
take a peek at the chat? We have a few questions right at the very end. There's 3 of them, starting with Kelly.
Let's see. Oh, Kelly, let me pull up an RR so I can look at it exactly, but I believe I know what you're saying. Hold on just a second.
And I'll go ahead and read the question just so that everybody that's on the Zoom can understand what you're responding to. It says, I noticed that on the request for repairs, seller response section does not have anywhere to say the seller agrees, but requires CR. I only see in the top buyer section, but this is confusing. Am I missing something?
Let's see. If you look at, okay, so if you go on the top section on 4A, if seller agrees to all buyers, it starts at 4 and then A is afterwards. If seller agrees to all buyers' requests or some of buyer's requests and buyer accepts seller's partial agreement of the following, buyer agrees to A, 1, remove the investigation property contingency. Then you have the option of accept the following, or 2B, buyer removes those contingencies identified on the attached and sends it over. And then you have 4B clarifies that the buyer releases seller from any loss from action regarding the disclosed condition of the property because of repairs and everything else. So that's where the information is it's saying, it's kind of written in right there that as long as the seller agrees in the next section, which is where we're used to seeing, we'll agree, but you have to give me the contingency, they're automatically doing it up above.
Okay, and then another question came in on the RPA. It says, in RPA 3D1 regarding EMD, which prevails? The percentage of sales price or the amount indicated? If sales price is negotiated to a different amount than on the initial RPA, which will prevail? The percentage or?
My understanding, MJ, and correct me from what we've done, it stays the same, right? Unless you change it on the counters.
If you use a straight percentage, it'll be adjusted to match. If the seller countered with a specific amount, it'll be the specific amount.
All right, and then for Dana, in regards to the AOAA, I think we will stay on after and have a discussion one-on-one in regards to that one.
And Dana, you can message me directly on that one too. Basically, bottom line is they don't have to sign everything. They only have to sign the first page. If it's an individual, myself, moving to my trust and I am the only signer, I don't need an AOA because I'm the only, as I like to say, trusts don't have hands. So I'm the only person who's looked at everything and I'm going to be the one who's actually signing it. So I've already seen all the docs. But if that entity I'm moving it to has an additional individual that's required to sign, then you need the AOA because you're adding another human being who also needs to sign all the documents. I don't know if that helps clarify.
It actually says you don't need the AOA. I thought it only said you don't need a re-sign. Because how else are you going to bring them into the transaction? You're going to have to use some sort of addendum to bring them into the transaction.
You can do, well, I've seen it a couple of different ways. I mean, yes, you can do I still am going to use an AOA for anybody I'm adding onto it, but it's not what I've always done before is just written, I'm trustee and just done it and had them sign twice on it and saying no additional.
Right, an RCSP at that point as well, right?
Right.
Yeah, so.
Because you got to prove that because you still got to prove that they have the signing authority of only the one person versus the other.
And now that I've heard that you reminded me about the signing, how many people are signing in the trust, because at that point you are so far down the transaction, it might not occur to you, but since you reminded me of that, I'm just going to stick to my existing procedures. I'm still going to have them sign the file. So I'd rather have over disclosure always makes me happy versus.
I don't want to give anybody wiggle room that somebody didn't see something. If your name's on that title, I want your name on every document.
Yeah. And when we say sign, the legally in California, sign means make a mark. So it could be an initial. It could be an initial on every page. And if we get somebody who's a real stickler for using their whole authority or something, but their mark would legally be enough.
The only caveat I would say to that from my notary and other experience is remember, if you were signing on behalf of an entity and you don't use your title, it could be construed that you were signing on behalf of yourself, not the entity, and you don't get afforded those whole protections, which is the whole point of having the entity.
I really mentioned it because at that point they're fed up with us as well. And I mean that lovingly, like they,
No, it's true.
I had to go, when I was a young escrow officer, somebody called me pedantic and I had to go look up what it meant. You know, it meant loving, creating drama for the sake of drama in paperwork, you know? And so, we get accused of that sometimes of, that they don't see that we have to CYA our file.
You're in the sue me state is what I tell people. I'm like, sorry, but I would rather if something goes wrong, I want to be able to say, we told you here, 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 here. And when I hear people go, well, my client's not signing another thing, I said, okay, put that in, send me an email. I've tried to do my due diligence. These all exist. Every single one of these paragraphs, every single one of these forms exists because somebody went to court. And I would really like to not be that person.
Yeah. All right. So couple reminders as well. There's no more questions in the chat. We do stay on afterwards. So if anybody has something specific that's a one-off, we'll stay on to answer those questions. Next week, we are off due to the holiday. And then we're back on the 24th with defensible space class. So it'll be the same Zoom link, same time. And we hope that everybody will join us for that. And then at the end of the month on the 31st, we have a new laws class. So, two good classes coming up. Again, we will take next week off due to the holiday. We know that schools are out and things like that. So we'll be taking next week off. MJ, you have any other updates other than that?
I'm taking suggestions for February. There is some temptation to repeat a little bit right now, but Sam, all of us had prepared for the whole first quarter to be catch-up time for everybody, but obviously that will diminish as time goes by. So I'm going to start trying to work in some of the more standard stuff. I'd like to go over assignments, all of their beauties and benefits and dangers. I'd like to go over those in February. I'd like to talk about 1031s again in February. But I want to make sure that we've settled everyone in to the best they can be on these forms. And so if you guys have a topic in mind, or you really feel like we're all seeing the funny memes where agents are logging in now and saying, hey, did something happen to the contract? So
my wish list is if we can find somebody explain solar and how we can jump, and if we can ever, I've been looking for somebody as well, just to explain the transfer process, even
solar down cold. I'll put that right back on for the first.
Yep, I think that's a really good one to start getting into.
Yep. In 1 year, in 2020, I settled outside of escrow 18 solars that were done wrong, bad, incomplete, misinformed, why escrow sometimes gets involved, when escrow doesn't get involved. So I'll throw that one right on. Thanks for the first week. That'll roll me into February. And if anybody else has any topics, be sure and let us know. Sam, I'm going to pick your brain to make sure my thoughts for the defensible space, the things I'm teaching for defensible space that I've covered, everything. Obviously, it's mostly a demonstration on how to do it and a discussion of those forms. So when we come back, I'd love for Sam's usually here anyway and backs us up. Anyway. So, but I'm going to check with you to make sure that I've covered everything you think is important.
Yep.
Otherwise.
Okay, so we still have 43 people on the Zoom, which is quite a bit of people. So I'm going to stop the recording at this point, but we're going to stay on. So if anybody has any questions to ask specifically in regards to things, we're going to be here to answer those for you. You're able to unmute yourself as well to do that. So thank you, everybody, for joining us today, and we look forward to seeing you again in a couple weeks.
Thank you again.
Have a great, productive week next week.